So could you please give Mr. Gifford a warm welcome?
Thank you. It's good to be here, and I think I know most of you, but my name is Russ Gifford, and I'm here to talk today about D-Day, Operation Overlord. Whoa, all the lights. Wow. Okay. 75 years. I guess I will just ask, do we have anybody in the room that was in the war? Okay. They would have to be in their 90s, but it's always possible, and that's one of the signs that I see, because when I first started doing these, I would have people show up. So today, it's kind of incumbent upon us to continue to tell their story, and that's what I'm going to try to do today. So, I always like to ask, what are you in for? And these are the things that I guess I'd like you thinking about as we go through this program. Why do we remember D-Day each year? That may seem like a simple question, but it might not be as simple as we think it is. And I'm going to ask you these questions when I get down to the end of this. If Operation Overlord had not been successful, what happens? What's the result? Is it all over? Is this a one and done? Do we never revisit it if it doesn't work? And how did we get to that, to the point where we were invading Europe? So, if this battle's so important, how did Eisenhower get chosen to run it? Did that have any significance in the outcome of the battle? Those are things I want you thinking about while we go through this. That sound fair? All right. As I said, in general, why are you here? What is it you're hoping to learn today? 1, 2. I always tell everybody, this isn't television. I can actually see and hear you. This guy knows I used to not have that option because I was on television. But anybody, what are you hoping to learn? Okay, hopefully those questions were the ones that you're hoping to learn then. All right. As early as 1942, the U.S. was committed to landing troops back on the European continent. Stalin, of course, demanded it because they were the only ones left. Remember, the Nazis had conquered France by that point. They had kicked Britain off the continent. Stalin is really the only one left still fighting with the USSR, and they're paying a very high price. Somewhere between 10 and 20 million people from the USSR would die in World War II. That dwarfs any numbers we have, right? Somewhere around 500,000. Okay, Churchill, though, is opposed to this concept. Why? Why Churchill? We always think of him as Mr. Gung-Ho. Why is Churchill so against it? Who came up with the failed landing in World War I down around Turkey? Yeah, Churchill. He was actually in charge, and he was the one that had said we should invade down by Turkey in World War I, and they paid a very high price for it. Okay, but also at the same time, he had watched Dunkirk happen. He had watched France fall. He wasn't really sure anybody was yet ready to take on the Nazis in 1942. So does that make sense? In other words, we have to overcome our partner, the one with the biggest vested interest, to invade Europe again. And that's going to be Roosevelt's job then, isn't it? All right. The big thing is we had a lot to learn, and in fact, the British the United Kingdom tries just a small raid in 1942. Does anybody know Dieppe? Ever heard of that? Probably one or two out there, but it's just a very small raid. In fact, the idea was they just wanted to find out, well, how alert are these guys? Because they'd had this idea, well, we should go and take some of these ports away from them so that if we ever do want to get back on the continent, we can. We'd have a way to get supplies in. What they did was they landed a group of Canadians, about 6,000 men, and they took terrible losses. At least almost 2,000 would end up prisoners. I mean, it's an incredible situation. It's one we don't hear of. There were, all told, I have here that it was 6,500 men. 60% were killed outright. So, 60% were killed, captured, or wounded. Whenever we talk about casualties, you're always saying killed, captured, or wounded. And by wounded, you mean too badly to be able to be an effective fighter for you again. So 60% losses out of 6,000, you're talking 3,600 men, right? Dieppe, it's way up here. This is France, and it's quite far up this way. Here is where we're going to show up in D-Day 2 years later, right? So, now, as learning steps, as training steps, they decide, and this is largely Churchill, because of course it's the British that are in Africa, right? So, in North Africa. So, and this is the Africa coast. This is the Spanish and Portugal peninsula. Churchill puts forward the idea that we should have an unopposed landing. This is Vichy French, Vichy. What do I mean by that? Yeah, essentially when the French surrendered, some of them, a great number of them, went to work for the Germans. And we call them Vichy French. And we had the hope that they would not oppose us landing, that the minute we would get there, they would greet us as heroes. We've never heard that before, have we? They hadn't then, but we hear it all the time now, don't we? Every time we're going to go invade somewhere, we're told they'll meet us, they'll greet us as heroes. It's exactly what they thought would happen here, that the French would go ahead and say, oh, you're back, now we can do this, we can work together. In reality, it doesn't work that way. The Americans will land over here. We've got the United Kingdom is going to land closer to Brook and where Rommel and all of his German troops are operating. The idea is they want to oppose that. This is 1942, November. And in landing, we still end up in a fight with the Vichy French, and we will lose 480 men in that fight. Now, this is not an Operation Overlord. This is not D-Day, but it's our first experience with truly a naval invasion, and we have a lot to learn. Well, everybody, of course, and Stalin's still pushing that we're coming back. You need to attack on the continent. Churchill's still going, no, we're not ready. And he says, well, we should, let's take Sicily. Let's invade Italy. We'll knock out Sicily first, then we'll take over Italy. You're all familiar with this? Okay. Yeah. They go ahead, and in reality, Patton does very well in North Africa. They wrap up North Africa before they get to this. By that point, Rommel's recalled from North Africa. So, Operation Torch was a success in Africa. We're ready to go on. They decide they'll take on Sicily. The hope is they'll be able to bag all of the Nazis that are there, all of the army that is there, so they don't get away. We get ashore, we do fine, but we don't capture anybody. The Nazis are able to evacuate to Italy, and they're waiting for us there, and we will go ahead and invade there as well. Anzio, Salerno, we will go ahead and do that. Anybody know, you remember Robert Dole? He was a senator. Terrible injuries that he'd gotten in World War II. Where did he get those at? In Italy. He was one of those soldiers that was trying to fight their way out of that landing area. In fact, the Anzio beachhead that they open up, many will wryly comment that it becomes the largest self-sustaining POW camp in the world, because the Allies, to begin with, and for a number of weeks, could not break out of the beachhead. We had a lot to learn. But time is running out. Stalin and the Soviets are paying a terrible price with nobody else to distract, with nobody else, no second front. That's what Stalin keeps asking for. You have to open up a second front. And of course, FDR's over there saying, what happens if Stalin gets fed up? He's getting closer. He's actually had a very painful victory at Stalingrad. What happens if he comes up with a separate peace with Hitler? Let's face it, he had signed a pact with him before World War II. What happens if the Soviet Union drops out of the war? And remember, that's what happened with Russia at the end of World War I, right? Wasn't the end of it. It was 1917. It's one of the reasons the Americans had to come in when they did, because the Russians had dropped out of the war. There's that fear that that could happen again. By the same token, Stalin is beginning to think that none of our promises are any good because we keep saying we're willing to open up a second front. So the pressure is on, even though we have not done as well as we'd like. Now, in reality, once they actually had a chance to bag that group, but the commander on the ground for the Nazis and Hitler agreed with him, said that it's not worth the risk, and they backed off and allowed the Americans then to move out of that beachhead, go up the boot, and finally, just before, they will knock Italy out of the war by taking Rome, right? But only because in reality, the Germans backed off. They said they feared that really America was planning a second front somewhere in Europe, and they didn't want to have everybody committed down in Italy. So, the way that Churchill was always talking about these attacks in the Mediterranean, we need to come up through the soft underbelly. General Mark Clark, who was in charge of the troops in Italy for the Americans, said, that's one tough gut. If you think that's a soft underbelly, I'm not sure what that is, but I don't want to find anything tougher. Now, the reality is Clark would be congratulated and given a medal for his work, but there are a lot of people, both within the structure of the Army, that feels he's part of the reason there was a problem there. And these are some of the things that Eisenhower needed to learn and to see. Sometimes you learn more from your failures than you do your successes, right? So, when Clark was too timid trying to work his way out of this, Ike noticed that. Now, how did Ike get to be in charge of both of these big invasions? He really wasn't on the list to be the next up after General Marshall. Yes. Yeah, it's a very interesting situation. This is a guy that had not commanded armies in the field prior to this, right? He'd always wanted to be like Patton. He and Patton were friends coming up. He'd wanted to be like Patton, have men under him, go fight tremendous battles, but instead, he was becoming one of the new types of generals, one of the administrators, one of the people that understood how important logistics was, and if you don't have supplies, your troops will never make it where you're trying to get them to go. Now, at the same time, as you're well aware of, there'd been the Battle of Britain, where the Germans tried by air power alone to knock the British out of the war. By doing what? bombing, and not just military targets, civilian targets, right? And it didn't work. And what did happen was, as America was also supplying a lot of the military material, such as airplanes, as America built up, as soon as that air war ended, which had cost, one of the reasons it ended is because it was costing the Nazis so much in air power, in their planes and in their fighters, that America and Britain then kept that air war going, turned it around, and started using it against the Germans on the continent. What that really did was it kept them in constant battles, and for the next 2 years, almost 2 years, there would be battles constantly in air power. And what that's doing is for want of a better word, bleeding off all of the German fighters and planes. You know, the great Luftwaffe is not the powerhouse that it had been early in the war, and by late 43, it is almost impossible for them to actually counter anything that's happening on the air power side. So, the problem is, it becomes very clear to everyone, just as it did to the Germans, that indiscriminate bombing is not going to knock anybody out of the war. It didn't knock the British out of the war, and it's not going to knock the Germans out of the war. The only way it's going to happen is if you have what we say today, boots on the ground, right? But if we were bleeding down the Germans, we need to realize something really important. That air war would cost 158,000 lives in pilots, navigators, and airmen on the Allied side. Yes? Yeah, I believe that is just from the, well, I need to take that back. We have to realize it is the European front. It is not including the Pacific theater. But remember, from the time we started getting property in Italy, we started flying B-17s out of Italy to bomb, especially the oil fields in Romania and Bulgaria that the Nazis were using. So, it's not just coming out of Britain, but it is all targeted toward the Nazis. That's a lot of lives, and interestingly enough, you may have read it in my piece, how many people will land, how many people will be part of the invasion at Normandy? 176,000. Interesting, isn't it? No, that is the entire Normandy invasion. Okay. Now, that's kind of important to us because many thousands of those people that were doing those bombing runs came through Sioux City. How come? Yeah, we had the air base, which was actually the Army air base at that time, and they were being trained how to do whatever their job was on the B-17. Because the B-17 had, I'm thinking, 10 or 12 people in it, all different jobs, and you had to learn your job to be effective in that. Anybody recognize this guy on the right? Yeah. Came out here from New York to learn how to be a navigator, how to be a bombardier on B-17s, and he would come back after the war. He's not the only one. But, by the way, this is a shot. I believe this is actually from 1945. I got this from the museum, but I think this is right after the war, but it's down at the air base at that time. And you can see the planes. So. But in the process of that air war, we had earned air superiority, and that becomes all important, and it is vitally important. It's one of those things they learned in those other invasions that they did. They need the air support to be able to effectively combat the enemy. So, by this point, the decision's inevitable. Churchill still has misgivings and will push back against it, but he agrees with Roosevelt that we have to have an invasion of Europe. And remember, Roosevelt has said from the very beginning that the goal is unconditional surrender. How come? Why? Yes. Yeah, but remember, the Germans were seeking an armistice, but when everybody stood down, it was almost impossible, A, for the Germans to continue fighting, but B, it was also impossible for the Allies. If the Germans had been able to fight, the Allies couldn't have put an army back together either. So FDR is adamant that the only result that's acceptable to the Allies is unconditional surrender. And that's what actually would happen with Italy, right? We said Italy was knocked out of the war. The only way they could do that was through an unconditional surrender, at which point we got to remember their friends, the Nazis, did what? Took over what part of the country they owned, that they were stationed in at that point. They did not accept that Italy was surrendering. So now, from a much earlier time, Eisenhower had this deep down gut feeling that we really don't have a choice. We've got to go to Europe and we have to fight them there. That's the only choice. He really felt the air war was never going to work. He had always thought that, but everything he did reinforced that. Every lesson he learned from those follow-up events reinforced that it was going to have to be a fight. Now, I'd mentioned the selection of Eisenhower. At this point, this man, George Marshall, he's a general, but he's actually in charge of everything on the military side for the Americans. He's well respected on all sides. He is one of those people, and you may recognize his name from something he came up with later called the Marshall Plan, right? So he's not just only military. The man is a genius. He had a belief that he was going to be the one in charge of Normandy. He was the one that had put together a lot of the plans. He's the one that had worked with this. He's also the one that had handpicked Eisenhower and moved him up to take over at Operation Torch in North Africa. And that had ruffled a lot of feathers because in the military, you go by your rank, your status. And Ike was below a number of these people that he'd gotten picked and pushed above. And that didn't sit well with a lot of people, especially when some of them had to then take orders from him in the following invasions. But Marshall had thought he would end up being in charge because think of the complexity of this invasion that they're considering for Europe. And it's really felt that Marshall's the only one that could do this. Well, the reality is Marshall's the only one that can make sure that all the goods, men, and material that is coming from the U.S. can get to England. I mean, technically, we're going to use England almost. I mean, we've been using it as an aircraft carrier, to fight this air war. We're now going to use it as a supply depot for the ground war. And the only way you're going to be able to get all that there is to have that coordinated, and Marshall is incredible at this. A bigger issue is Marshall is the one person that FDR trusts. Marshall sees FDR as the one person who has his back because they agree on what they intend to achieve in this war. And as we've seen in war after war after war in America, if that unity of purpose is not there, what do you have? Failure. That's really what it works out to, right? Until those two people end up in sync, it's not going to happen. You can look at the American Civil War, right? Until Grant became Lincoln's general, there was no possibility that that was going to succeed. So, and many others other than that. So, Churchill, of course, was perfectly comfortable with Marshall, as is everyone else. So suddenly they have to decide if they like Ike. Of course, he is Ike. And being Ike, because Marshall just turned around and said, if it's not me, it's him. And all of them respected Marshall enough to say, okay. And they did. And they would find out that he was the right choice. Mainly because what Marshall had seen is Ike had had to work with the personalities, because remember, these are joint operations. They're not American operations, right? You saw that I showed in Operation Torch. There are British landings. There are UK landings. There are American landings. Somebody has to be able to get along with the personalities involved to make it work. And I don't know about you. Did you get to be a general because you got along with people? Yeah, I don't think so. Okay. So I said it ruffled feathers. Marshall doesn't care. It was the right choice. And in January 44, he commands that Ike has to go to England to receive his orders. Here's the orders. Just want you to think about this. You show up and they look at you. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have shown up. They look at you and they say, you will enter the continent of Europe. You will undertake operations aimed at the heart of Germany and the destruction of her armed forces. Well, snap, you know, that's easy, right? As I said, Ike is one of those new kinds of general. He's never led an army on the battlefield, and that goes down badly with certain people in the British command structure. Anybody got a name for the one that doesn't like it the most? Somebody named Montgomery, right? Can't stand it. And in some ways, he might have a little point. You know, the Americans had quite a material advantage when they came up against a portion of Rommel's army. What happened in that first battle in Africa? Yeah, they got rolled over. That was well put. And kind of sets a tone, but in reality, they came back, didn't they? They learned from it. Got rid of a couple of generals that shouldn't have been in that position. And that's one of the things, again, that Ike's good at. He puts the right people in the right places, and he's not bound by a situation that says just because I know you or just because you might be my friend, you can stay in that position. That's something else that doesn't happen a lot in the military, right? A lot of times you will cover for that person. Ike wouldn't do that, as we'd see later with somebody that was his best friend named what? Patton, right? Okay. He was the guy that had been behind these previous invasions and planning them, and he did learn a lot. So here's the plan they come up with. Now, here's the thing you need to realize. Looks like a lot of people. It is a lot of people. They're going to throw something like what? 4, 5, 6, 8 divisions in one fell swoop at the Germans. That sounds like a lot until you realize that the Germans have somewhere around 59 divisions on the continent. But the difference is the Germans have to defend everything. Now, realize that a big part of this battle happens before the first shot is ever fired. And they have been working on this for over a year. It is a plan of deception in which they've taken Patton offline to supposedly lead all the forces that are going to invade Europe. And they have been putting out phony cables and everything else for this new first army that they have created in England, and have Patton there with them to the point where they will have him review troops and everything else. Patton, of course, is not thrilled about this, but being a soldier, he's taking what he's told to do literally. Now, mind you, his troops involve a heck of a lot of inflatable tanks, mannequins and dummies. It's an amazing effort at deception, and the reality is the Germans buy into it completely because they are positive that the best general on the American side is who? The only one they're afraid of is who? They cannot believe that anybody would sideline Patton, which is, of course, what Dwight D. Eisenhower had done when Patton, after the second time around, had kind of stepped off the reservation, right? But he also defended and kept Patton in an active duty situation where others wanted him fired, right? So, yes, and the big point was they made it sound like they were going to attack the easiest spot in the world to do, which would be Calais, would be directly across at the shortest point across the channel. So, and also mainly because Hitler and everyone else was convinced that no matter what, because of that horrendous number difference of troops that you're bringing in versus the troops that you're going to be facing, that you would have to have a port. No matter what, you would have to capture a port within your first day to be able to resupply those troops that you had there. What they didn't realize is that American ingenuity had created a portable port. In fact, they make two of them. They call them mulberries, and they are floating ports made out of essentially ships that have already been sunk and everything else, and they will end up towing those over, and they are functioning. They would rather have a port, but they're also well aware, as happens in real life, that if they are pushing the Germans out of a port, the Germans will destroy everything functional in that fort before they leave it, which is what they do for the one they do capture at D-Day. So, as I said, they're going to have 1,700 men. It's going to be a combined air and water operation. And one of the things that Eisenhower will say to these guys is the one thing you don't have to worry about is if you see planes above you, don't worry, they're ours. Because that is a concern, right? It had happened to them before. It had happened to the British before at Dunkirk, right? There's a lot of trouble. So, you know, if the cloud cover is too great, you're not going to have any cover, or excuse me, you're not going to have any air cover provided. But then the enemy won't be flying either if the cloud cover is too great. And that's the biggest enemy that the Allies have as far as the air power goes. So, it's the weather. Yep. All right. By this point, all of southern England's an army camp. They've got 2.8 million American soldiers. Well, I shouldn't say American. They've got 2.8 million soldiers there. They're crowded in with everything they need and would require. And the question is, how long can they get away with that? How long before it's discovered? The clock is inexorable. It's ticking. There's fear. There's concern. One of the things that Eisenhower says is, this mighty host was as tense as a great human spring coiled, waiting for that moment when it would explode. Waiting for that release. They've got certain requirements in the tides, in the moon, in the phases of the moon and everything else. They have a chance that if they attack at the beginning of June, they've got about 3 days of possibilities there. If they can attack then, they're fine. Otherwise, they're going to have to wait 3 weeks before the next option. But the weather stinks on June 5th. They still have to put the troops into the ships and send them out. They get halfway across the channel and they have to wait. He is on the 5th. You know, they'll go out and say, oh, it's not going to work, so they bring him back to port, but they're still sitting there in port. And on June 5th, he has to make the decision, are we going to try it on the 6th? How good is weather forecast when you were young? Okay, now go back an additional 20 to 30 years. Tell me, how good do you think they were then? Not. But they've got one guy who's telling Ike, that Ike trusts, that says you've got a little window on the 6th. If you don't go then, the next day is not going to work. It'll be clouded over again. You've got this window if you want to do it. Otherwise, you're going to have to wait 3 weeks, and there's no guarantee the weather will be any better then. Can you keep these guys hidden for that long? Tick, tick, tick. And this is one of the reasons that Ike is the one picked for this. The British, while they're perfectly willing, while Montgomery and Tedder and the rest are all perfectly willing to say, oh, yes, we agree with you either way, at the same time, they're also saying, oh, he can't make a decision. But they, when it's put to them, don't really want to go either. They don't want to take the chance. They don't want to be the biggest failure. If this is going to be the biggest operation in the world, they don't want to be the owner that had the biggest failure. Here's the concept. They've already got it broken up. They're going to start with paratroops coming in from both sides to disrupt things in the background, and they're going to have these 5 divisions coming in. Largest one will be the American division landing at Omaha. Second, you've got Utah Beach. So in other words, you've got the UK this way, you've got the Americans that way, right? Tick, tick, tick. They're trying to do something that's never been done. Nobody is convinced it can be done. And the longer they wait, the more likely it is the Germans are going to discover what they're doing. Ike makes the decision. When he made the temporary decision, they went ahead and sent the ships out to the middle of the channel so that if he said go for 0600, they could go. He decides late in the afternoon, it's a go. After midnight, they're going to send in the paratroops. He goes out. Having made the decision, he goes out to talk to them. Has a man-to-man discussion with them, knowing full well some of these guys aren't going to come back. A lot of them are towed over in gliders. You know, a lot of the equipment is going to be towed over for their part of the operation. So the American troops are designed to go behind and disrupt communications, cut off and take some of the crossroads towns to hold up in case, I don't know, in case these panzer groups start coming at them. You know, the toughest troops that the Germans still have. You're coming in by air. That kind of means you don't have any tanks, right? Right. So, panzers, of course, mean you do have tanks. The British are going to go over and they're going to seize 2 bridges. Pegasus Bridge is one of them. So they're coming in by gliders, trying to land as groups. He makes the decision. I need to go back. By the way, see this guy right back here? Got a little notebook. We'll talk about him a little later, but I'm thinking he is from Iowa. I'm thinking he might even be from Sioux City. So when Ike gives it the go-ahead, he puts out this famous order that I'm sure you all remember: soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you're about to embark on the Great Crusade. toward which we've striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. Your task will not be an easy one. It's a moving statement, and there's a lot of guys who do make it back. They've folded that up and put it in their pocket, and they will hang it in their home when they get back, if they get back. I have full courage and confidence in your devotion to duty and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. That's nothing like it. So 3 divisions of paratroops are going to drop behind the beaches shortly after midnight. And it starts going wrong right there. The flak and all the rest of it is much heavier than they expect. They take a lot of casualties, but their goal is to keep those German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Now, by the way, there's a guy from Storm Lake, Iowa. You keep hearing them say it was such a nice, moonlit, clear night, but it was anything but. It was darker than pitch. That's Jack Prince. He's from Storm Lake. He flew 21 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division to a drop zone near that city they're supposed to take. Local people you might know. The weather doesn't make it any easier since it was delayed by a day. The ships have been in the channel. There are guys that have been seasick for a full day at this point, right? Does that take a lot out of you? Well, now what happens when they tell you, go over the edge of the boat and climb down this rope net and jump into, well, you know, that LCD you're supposed to be jumping into, it's going like this. So time it so that it's at the top when you let go and drop in. You got guys with broken ankles before they ever get to the battlefield. There's 4,600 ships. 600 of those are warships. They're destroyers and above that are going to be there for their naval bombardment capability, there to protect these flimsy little shoeboxes that they're sending out. The idea is we've got this great plan that everything's going to go off like clockwork. By the way, this dotted red line here, that's the goal for the first day. That's where they want to be. Going to land on the beaches. They're going to get up here. By the way, there's nothing up here, right? It's just that it's, like the bluffs out here. You got to climb them, right? No, there's reinforced concrete bunkers that are expecting to get hammered by big shells and can take just about anything but a direct hit from one of those. So it's going to go off at 6:30. That's when the men are supposed to land. So you want everything else to happen before that. Supposed to start at 6. Of course, a couple of people don't get the memo. A couple of the British ships start shooting at 5:30. Whoops, so much for that element of surprise. But anyway, you got airplanes coming in at the same time. Thousands of them. In fact, with the paratroops and everything else, I think there's something like 11,000 planes involved in this. 4,600 ships, 11,000 planes. There's a lot going on here, right? You could kind of expect one or two not to get the memo. Okay. They're supposed to strike the beaches and the gun emplacements with the airplanes, with the bombers coming over. And they're supposed to hit it, and they got to have light to see it. So they're supposed to hit it right around the time, if we don't hit them, they're going to see all the ships out there. They're going to be coming into range, and they're going to start shooting at the ships. So they're coming over the top, and the problem is, while most of them do a very good job, the ones coming over the Omaha beach emplacements, the cloud cover is so thick there, they have to go above the clouds, and their problem is they're guessing when to drop. And their real problem is if they guess badly, who are they going to drop these on? Guys in floating shoeboxes. So they hold up, and essentially they're totally ineffective at Omaha Beach. They don't take out anything in those emplacements. All the others did well because the cloud cover was much less and they were able to come under it. These guys, not a chance. Here's a guy that was on one of those bombing runs. We knew it was big. I could see the ships and the pursuit planes below. One of them says, I kept looking back. It looked like I could walk from ship to ship all the way back to England, except for this ocean that's throwing everything around. This is Victor Scholten. He's a Sheldon High School grad in 38. He's from Primgar, I think. He wrote down that it took 7 hours to make that run. Now, those ones that had started at 5:30, the rest of them wait till 6 o'clock. Start with their big guns and they're opening fire. Again, they can't see Omaha Beach. The cloud cover is too dark. Worse, they don't have as big as ships, and where they were told to basically be safe from the mines, they didn't have any room to maneuver, and thus you only had about half the firepower coming out of those ships that were assigned to Omaha Beach. So it's just bad to worse for Omaha Beach. Now, Eisenhower expected this. Plans are everything before battle. They're useless once it begins, and he knew it. You have to rely on the men and their training at that point. By the way, these are the gliders. Got another Iowa boy there. He was a radio operator, a Jeep driver. He crashed in one of those, named Jeff Euchre. So they still came out better than they expected. And despite incredible losses in the paratroops, their goals by the end of the day were almost all met. And the enemy phone and telegraph completely disrupted. Not a chance. So here's June 6th. This is actually what it looked like for some of them. It's like being in an ocean in a damn dishpan. That's D.H. Mosman. He's an Allen High School grad in 39. His job is he's supposed to drive a bulldozer through the seawall. He said they got out so far that a lot of the guys just fell into shell holes from the shots falling short and drowned. Because the packs they're carrying is so heavy with ammunition, they can't float. If they, and that's the other problem that happens to Omaha Beach. They end up stopping short, and the guys have half a mile or more to walk, and it's in deep water. So, some of these pictures. George Miles from Boyden, Iowa. His line was, they said, what did you do when the gate opened? I said a prayer. So what else could I do? Now, everybody faces a fight, but every situation is better than at Omaha Beach. The cloud cover that was over Omaha, as you can see, there's a distance to Utah. They didn't have that problem. In fact, Utah, the pre-fight bombardment had been so effective that they don't even fight for 2 hours, and they give up. Things are happening so fast, you're just concentrating on staying alive. That's Frank Raymond on when he was asked what was going through his mind when the landing craft gate opened at Omaha Beach. Raymond was with the 5th Rangers. He was from Little Sioux. The issue of the Rangers, did you get an easy job if you were in the Rangers? No, his job was he was supposed to go up and clear the paths of mines and everything else and mark them with tape so the guys knew where they could run. I can still see the boys on the beach. I see a boy getting plasma. They said to me, "Don't stop." That was George Mills again from Boyden. Chaotic. The heavy packs are going to cause deaths. So the landing boats unload too far from the beaches, but not as many deaths as the unimpeded crossfire. Because what happens here is since nothing is knocked out, even the light, small pillboxes are operating, which they aren't on the others. While some of the big guns are, the machine guns are still able to get a crossfire that they set up on that beach. And guys will be pinned down out in the surf, and they will stay there. They have nowhere to go. Harold Van Valkenburg. When the front gate of my landing craft opened, my life changed and has not been the same since. What an amazing statement. As I said, 3 hours at Utah Beach. British and Canadian beaches had heavier fighting, but they went well. The difference is, in reality, they didn't take con. They didn't take their objectives on the first day either. Now, the problems, I've already said all these on Omaha Beach. I didn't mention the last one. They had tanks that were supposed to help give them cover to take out those machine gun pillboxes and nests. They had been designed to have this little floating skirt. All but 2 out of the 97 sank, killing their crews because they stopped too far out. Omar Bradley is watching this from the command ship, and he's saying that he thought about withdrawing the troops, but that would leave the success at all the other beaches vulnerable. So he grimly held on, and so did the troops. One of the colonels is quoted as saying, if we're going to die here, we might as well die fighting. It's all bluster, but it was the only choice, and you have individuals step up. I think 3 medals of honor will be awarded at Omaha Beach for that first day of fighting. The leaders begin to improvise, and they're not the leaders they thought. When that second wave came in, almost the entire command staff was cut down. So, here's what I want you to think about. They persevere. They figure out how to get it done. They use things that they didn't have for the cantina wire and things. They use their torpedoes and everything else to make it happen. And even at Omaha with the gridlock, because what happens is the second and third come in on top of the first since they haven't even got off out of the water, let alone on the beach, and they haven't made it to their exits. By day's end, they still have 34,000 soldiers out of their group have made it they've made it there. They have a toehold, which is all anybody else has too. Here's the numbers. It took 11,000 aircraft. They lost only 127. They flew 14,000 sorties. Deaths will end up being 4,400. Out of that, the Americans bear the brunt of it, and out of that, most of those are at Omaha Beach. They take a tremendous amount of casualties. It's not quite 10%. What's happening here? What's happening at home? It will make the papers a day later, but CBS Radio picks up a broadcast on the day of. Who's broadcasting? No, it's the Germans are telling the world that they're being invaded. And the CBS guys are going, well, we don't have any confirmation of this, but we just thought we'd tell you about it. Well, then it gets more serious and more serious, and finally, they get a statement out of Ike, because by that time, with the time zone difference, they realize they're not going to be thrown back in the sea. That's the one concern. What happens if you can't even make it? They don't make it to that red line, but they're not going to be thrown back in the sea, and tomorrow's another day, and there's no way they can stop them tomorrow. Here's another Allied Army smashes inland. Notice it's all very positive. New York Times, the seawall is breached, invaders fighting their way. Okay. I thought I had a minute. I'm sorry. So, folks, that's really it. If you're just wondering, please queue up. They want you to go out. I was close. I was so close.
What a finale. What a finale.
Thank you.
You know how to...
So who was the guy with the notebook?